All right, so today we're tackling a pretty heavy subject.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's one of those things that everyone thinks they understand.
Right.
But as we dug into this medical review article you sent over,
Yeah.
it turns out brain death is a lot more complicated than it seems on the surface.
Oh, it definitely is. And,
Yeah.
for most of human history, defining death was relatively simple.
Right, like no heartbeat, no breath, game over.
Exactly. But then
All right.
the 20th century happened. We had all these medical advancements, CPR, organ transplantation, and of course, ventilators.
Right, we learned how to keep bodies alive even when
Exactly.
maybe they weren't really alive anymore.
That's the question, isn't it? And it was these technologies that really forced a reevaluation of what it means to die.
Right.
Because suddenly you could have a person with no brain function, but their heart was still beating because a machine was doing the work for it.
It's like, where do you draw the line then? When is a person truly gone?
Right. And the article points to this 1959 paper as a sort of turning point. It's where researchers first used the term le coma dépassé, basically an irreversible coma.
1959. That feels surprisingly recent given how much we talk about brain death these days.
It is recent when you think about it, and it speaks to how rapidly medicine has advanced in a relatively short period.
So this idea emerges, but we're clearly still wrestling with it, right? Because what exactly is brain death?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Is it the complete and irreversible loss of all brain function, including the brainstem, which controls those basic functions like breathing?
Right.
Or is it enough that the higher brain, the part responsible for consciousness and personality, is gone, even if the brainstem is still somewhat active?
So you can have a situation where the heart is beating, but the person, for lack of a better term, isn't really there.
Precisely. And that's where things get really ethically complicated. Because if you declare someone brain dead based on one set of criteria, but their heart is still going, it raises these incredibly difficult questions about organ donation, end-of-life care, even what it means to respect a person's wishes.
It really makes you think, is there even a single right answer here?
That's the heart of the matter, isn't it? And to complicate things even further, determining brain death is not always a simple yes or no, even with the technology we have today.
You mean there are cases where it's hard to tell?
Absolutely. The article mentions a patient who went into cardiac arrest.
Okay.
And the initial CT scan, it showed brain injury, but the brain structures were still there. It wasn't until they did a second scan, 36 hours later, that they saw the true extent of the damage. The brain had deteriorated significantly during that time.
Wow, so it's not always instantaneous. Brain death can actually be a process.
Sometimes, yes. And it highlights why careful observation is so important. And why, in these cases, doctors often do multiple assessments over a period of time before making a determination. You can't rush something this important.
Okay, so we know that figuring out brain death is this really complex thing with huge ethical questions. But let's get down to the nuts and bolts for a second. How do doctors actually determine if someone is brain dead?
You'd think it's as simple as someone being in a coma, but
Yeah.
it's actually a lot more involved than that.
Really? I think most people would assume that being in a coma is the same as brain death.
It's a common misconception. There's this whole set of clinical criteria that need to be met before a patient is even considered for a brain death exam.
So what are doctors looking for?
First things first, they have to rule out any other conditions that could look like brain death. Things like really bad metabolic issues or drug overdoses.
Right, because some medications can make the brain super sluggish.
Exactly, like certain sedatives or medications used in intensive care. And even body temperature matters. If someone is hypothermic, their brain function slows down so much that it could seem like there's no activity at all.
Wow, so many things to consider. Okay, so once those other possibilities are out of the way, how do they actually test for brain death?
Well, it starts with a full neurological exam, and the focus is on what are called brainstem reflexes, those super basic involuntary responses that are controlled by the brainstem. Remember, we talked about the brainstem earlier.
Right, because it controls those vital functions, breathing, heartbeat.
Exactly. So if those reflexes are totally gone, and I mean completely and irreversibly gone, then that means the brainstem isn't working, which usually means brain death.
Okay, so what kind of tests are we talking about here? Give me some examples.
You've heard of the pupillary light reflex, right?
Yeah, shining light to see if the pupils constrict.
That's the one, but there are others that most people don't know about.
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, there's something called the corneal reflex, where they touch the cornea to see if the person blinks.
Makes sense.
And then there are these two, the oculocephalic and oculovestibular reflexes. They sound very medical, but basically they're looking at whether the eyes move in response to head movements or to having some ice water put in the ear.
Wow, those last two sound kind of intense. What exactly are the doctors looking for there?
It all has to do with the connections between the brainstem and those cranial nerves that control how your eyes move. If the connection isn't there, the eyes won't react the way they should in a living person.
It's fascinating how these tiny, subtle reactions that most of us never think about play such a big role.
It really is. And then, of course, there's the apnea test.
Right, the apnea test that always feels like a big deal. Did
Definitely.
you walk me through what actually happens during that test?
It's actually more straightforward than it sounds. They briefly take the patient off the ventilator to see if they try to breathe on their own.
Because our natural instinct when CO2 builds up in our blood is to breathe, right?
Exactly. It's all controlled by, you guessed it, the brainstem. So if there's no effort to breathe, even with those higher CO2 levels, it's a big red flag that the brainstem isn't working properly.
But isn't that incredibly risky? Taking someone off a ventilator if they can't breathe on their own.
You raise a valid point. It is a very delicate procedure, and it's only done in a very controlled setting with careful monitoring and a plan to get the patient back on the ventilator if needed. And before they even start, they make sure the blood oxygen levels are safe.
It really shows how complex these evaluations are. They don't take any chances.
Absolutely not. But even with all these precautions, all these tests, sometimes it's still not clear-cut.
So there are times when even after all that, the diagnosis is still uncertain.
Exactly. And that's where even more specialized tests can be helpful.
So we're talking about those situations where even after all the clinical tests, all those reflexes in the apnea test, there's still some question about whether someone truly meets the criteria for brain death.
Exactly. And that's where these, what are called ancillary tests can be really helpful.
Ancillary tests, what are those? What makes them different?
Well, they're basically additional ways to look at brain activity, to get a more complete picture and help make that final determination.
So is this where we get into like the really high-tech brain imaging and stuff?
Yeah, you could say that. One of the gold standards is something called a digital subtraction angiography, or DSA.
The essay, okay, that one sounds pretty intense.
Right.
What does that even involve?
So it's a special type of X-ray where they inject a dye into the blood vessels of the brain.
Okay.
And if there's no blood flow like you'd expect in brain death, then the dye just doesn't circulate, it doesn't go anywhere.
So it creates a really clear picture of whether or not things are moving in there.
Precisely. But of course, like any medical procedure, there are risks involved. And it requires moving the patient to a special radiology suite, which isn't always possible depending on how sick they are.
Right. Makes sense. So it's the most accurate, but not always practical. Are there other options that are maybe less invasive?
Yeah, definitely. One that's becoming more common is something called SPECT, which stands for Single Photon Emission Computed Tomography.
SPECT.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to need a little help with that one. What's different about that one?
So it's still an imaging technique, but instead of X-rays, they use a tiny amount of radioactive tracer that's injected into the bloodstream.
Okay.
And the tracer is absorbed by active brain cells, so if there's no uptake, if the tracer doesn't go to certain areas, it suggests those cells aren't actually working.
So basically it lets you see which parts of the brain are on and which
Yeah.
parts are off.
Exactly. And because it's less invasive than DSA, it's often preferred, especially for people who are already really sick in the ICU.
This is all so fascinating. What other tools are out there when it comes to figuring out brain activity in these tricky cases?
Well, there's another one called transcranial Doppler, or TCD. And this one is really interesting because it uses sound waves to measure the blood flow in the brain.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And the best part is it's totally non-invasive. They can do it right there at the bedside.
That sounds almost too easy. What's the downside?
Well, it all depends on whether they can get a good signal. You see, about 10% of people have skulls that are just shaped in a way that makes it hard to get those sound waves through.
So it works great for some, but not everyone. It really goes to show how much these assessments need to be tailored to each individual patient.
That's a really good point. And then you have those even more advanced imaging techniques like CT angiography, MRI, MRA, each with its pros and cons.
It sounds like there's a whole arsenal of tools they can use.
There is. And the doctors have to really consider all the factors to decide which test makes the most sense for each patient. But even with all these amazing advancements, as you said earlier, there are some situations where determining brain death gets even trickier, both medically and ethically.
You're talking about things like ECMO, right? Where
Yeah.
a machine takes over for the heart and lungs.
Exactly. When the heart is beating, but it's only because of an external device, it kind of throws a wrench into those traditional ideas of death, which we're always so focused on the absence of a heartbeat.
Right. It makes you really wonder, what is the difference between life and death when technology is involved?
It's a huge question. And then there's targeted temperature management, or TTM.
Oh, right, TTM. Remind me what that is again.
So it's when they basically induce hypothermia after a cardiac arrest to try to protect the brain.
Okay.
But here's the thing, hypothermia slows down everything in the body, including brain activity. So someone undergoing PTM might actually appear brain dead on certain tests, even though their brain could potentially recover.
Wow, that's incredible. It's like every medical advancement, even though it's designed to save lives, brings with it a whole new set of ethical and practical questions.
It really does speak to how important it is to keep talking about these things, not just in the medical world, but as a society. We need to keep the conversation going as medicine continues to change.
Absolutely. Earlier you mentioned this group trying to come up with some global guidelines for determining brain death.
Yes, the World Brain Death Project.
Right, right. Tell me more about what they're trying to do.
Their goal is to create this set of standards that could apply everywhere in the world, a kind of universal definition for brain death.
That seems like a really important step, especially when you think about all the implications that go beyond just the medical diagnosis. It's a profound human experience no matter what.
Absolutely. And it's crucial to remember that compassion and empathy are just as important as any test or technology.
I completely agree. It's been an amazing deep dive into this subject, and you've given us a lot to consider. Thank you so much for that.
My pleasure. It's such an important topic, and I think the more we talk about it, the better equipped we'll be to navigate these complex situations.
Absolutely. If you're interested in taking a deeper dive into this topic, we encourage you to check out the full medical review article we've been discussing. It's definitely worth a read. And as always, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of science and medicine. We'll see you next time.